I think it's pretty universally known that the physiologic effects of chronic levels of perceived stress are pretty harmful for our body, right? The question is, how do you lessen that perceived stress? But also, how do you lessen the physiological repercussions of that stress that it has on your body? Now, obviously, there's a number of ways to do that, right? Counseling is certainly up there. Exercise is probably the most researched. Mindfulness is certainly getting up there in the research. Breathing techniques, yoga, and I think all of these definitely should be your first line of defense that you employ to not only help mitigate your perceived stress, but also the physiologic repercussions of that stress. But for those who want to hit the easy button, and I know there's a lot of people out there who do, there are supplements that can help with this. And I'm referring to this broad category of supplements called adaptogens. Now, these include compounds like ashwagandha, Siberian ginseng, rhodiola, 5-flavor berry. So in order to explain this properly, let's just take a very quick look at inflammation, because that's really the main way that chronic perceived stress negatively affects our body. And then inflammation has a number of different ways that it can cause problems with our body. But the main one is this thing called the NF-kappa B pathway. And we're not going to dive deep into this, so just bear with me for a second. So I took this picture from this paper, and this paper has been cited by 1,200 other research papers. Pretty important one. But basically, you have this transcription factor called NF-kappa B, or nuclear factor kappa beta, which can go into the nucleus, and it tells the DNA to make certain inflammatory chemicals, including cytokines. Those cytokines are then released by the nucleus, and then they trigger more NF-kappa B. The NF-kappa B goes back into the nucleus, tells the DNA to make more cytokines, which triggers NF-kappa B production. So you can see how this is a self-amplifying loop. Now, when someone takes anti-inflammatory steroids, otherwise known as glucocorticoids, we can see in this picture that glucocorticoids interrupt this NF-kappa B pathway. Now, one of the main steroids that people use to combat inflammation is called cortisone. But cortisone is derived from cortisol, which is a hormone that your body makes, right? Now, it's also known as the stress hormone, right? And it's got a bad rap for that. But the reality is, when you undergo high levels of stress, let's say like you're in a car accident or something like that, your body produces cortisol, right? And it does so because cortisol, it does a number of different things, but one of the things that it does is it reduces inflammation, right? So if your body is in an acute stress situation, your body produces a lot of cortisol, and cortisol reduces inflammation, which is great. But if we're undergoing chronic high levels of perceived stress, and our body's always releasing cortisol, then the receptors that react to cortisol start downregulating. So that means if cortisol is normally anti-inflammatory, but the receptors are downregulated so cortisol doesn't work as well, you lose that anti-inflammatory property of cortisol. So chronic levels of high stress reduce the effectiveness of cortisol, and then you end up with higher levels of inflammation. So this is what chronic stress does, right? It creates chronic inflammation, and that leads to cardiovascular disease, neurodegenerative conditions, cancer, and all sorts of other nasty health conditions, right? So let's take a look at adaptogens, all right? Because that's what the whole video was supposed to be about. So let's take a look at this study that was done on mice, and they were forced to undergo forced swimming. Basically, the mice were forced to swim until exhaustion, at which point they thought they were going to drown. And obviously that's highly stressful. Now, don't get mad at me. I didn't make the study. I'm just reporting on it, all right? But what they did in this experiment is with these mice, half of them got adaptogens and half of them didn't. And then they were all forced to swim to exhaustion, which is obviously stressful. You think you're gonna drown. But what ends up happening is that the mice that were given the adaptogens, when you look at the blood markers of inflammation and cortisol, they're significantly reduced, right? So did that mean that the mice weren't stressed out? Of course they were stressed out. They thought they were going to drown. But the reality is the physiological impact of stress, like the negative aspects of stress in the blood, were not necessarily there compared to the group that wasn't on the adaptogens. Does that make sense? So you still perceive stress, but the negative consequences of the stress are significantly lessened when you take adaptogens. So let's take a look at this meta-analysis that was done looking at all the studies that have ever been done on adaptogens, and you can see that adaptogens reduce this NF-kappa B pathway. which consequently reduce the physiologic effects of stress chemistry in your blood. So even though you may perceive ongoing stress, the negative impacts are mitigated with taking adaptogens. Now, when taking adaptogens, as I mentioned earlier, there's a whole slew of different types of adaptogens, right? And sometimes you can get formulas where they just mix a lot of them together, but you really have to be careful of that. So if we take ashwagandha as an example, it's one of the most researched ones. Ashwagandha certainly lowers cortisol levels, right? But it also increases testosterone, sorry. So what that means then is, let's say you're a female with PCOS, which is polycystic ovarian syndrome. One of the hallmark things of PCOS is high levels of testosterone in a female. So would that female want to take ashwagandha? Probably not, because it's going to compound the problem and make the testosterone go even higher. But also, since ashwagandha lowers cortisol levels, we have a natural rhythm of cortisol through the day, right? We have cortisol that's supposed to rise quickly in the morning because cortisol makes us alert. But then it's supposed to decline in the evening, and it's sort of like reciprocal with melatonin. So let's say you take ashwagandha in the morning when cortisol levels are supposed to be going up, and ashwagandha lessens cortisol. You certainly wouldn't want to do that. You would want to take ashwagandha at night. Does that make sense? But when it comes to like 5-flavor berry or Siberian ginseng or rhodiola, those tend to make you more alert and more awake. So you wouldn't want to take those at night, you would want to take those in the morning. So adaptogens are something that is a supplement that you can take that certainly lessens the physiological negative effects of chronic perceived stress. You may not necessarily feel like you are having less stress, but what the studies are showing is that it really does reduce the inflammatory effects of chronic perceived stress. So if you want to know more about it, please let us know, drop us a line, be happy to help you out.